Okay, so we mentioned that we had Or Noga, the initial book by early Reform, Responsa, particularly about organs in Shul and prayer in the vernacular. Then we have the book of the Hamburg Bezdin, writing against that. Eli Divrei Brit is the Word of the Covenant, and this is a book by Rabbi Yisrael Meir Yisrael Breslau, who is clearly a Talmid Chacham, very scholarly. Cherev Nokem Nekam Brit, the sword that avenges the covenant, clearly a book against Eli Divrei Brit. These are the words of the covenant. And then there'll be other books written back and forth. You can see this is taken from the Library of Chabad, I think 2 Chabad rabbis ago, and it's from Hebrew books. Now, what's interesting about this book is it's really shocking when you read it, and you'll see it. We'll read through parts of it. Right, what you would expect, what would you expect, right? We already had, 3 or 4, we had 3 responsa and more in the initial book by the reformers about basically looking at the Shulchan Aruch and saying, it doesn't seem like that big a deal to have an organ on a weekday. And even hiring a non-Jewish organist on Shabbos seems okay from the Shulchan Aruch. And this is going to be great for the Jews and for engaging, Jews and fighting against, modernism, retaining tradition. Then you have the rabbis of the Hamburg Bezdin writing back and saying, this is terrible. You can't do this. So what would you expect next? So in theory, what you would expect is more halachic argument, right? Because that's the playing field. But this book doesn't do that. Let's look him up. It's not so easy to find information on, but there's like a Wikipedia article. I had a hard time finding information about him. I have to look, but I did find some. But this is published it's 1819, and I think it's in, let's see where it's published. I think it's published in Dessau. But what you'll see is that the nature of this book, right? Question is, what other direction could you go in, right? Besides just writing another set of responsa, because that's already been done, right? In other words, the responsa pro and con have already been written. So what do you do next, right? So in theory, you're going to make, a theological argument. You'll argue that the Enlightenment is so threatening that unless we cater to Enlightenment Jews and make Judaism seem modern, it's not going to work. So his method is, I couldn't understand. I just could not understand what was going on in the book, because when I read it, and you'll see it, it feels like you're reading the Chassam Sofer 40 years later writing against the Reform. His method is so rabbinic, and he writes as if the people he's writing against, which is the Hamburg Bezdin, he writes as if the Hamburg Bezdin are these enormous sinners for what they're doing. And the way that he writes it, it's like he's trying to put them in cherem or something. He's trying to excommunicate them. It just doesn't, it didn't make any sense for a reformer to be writing this way. So, so I asked a few scholars that I know, Rachel Mannigan and Mark Shapiro. I said, have you ever heard of this book and what's going on? And so Rachel Mannigan directed me to an article by a professor named Friedlander, which is an article in Hebrew, and it's quite academic. It's not so easy to read, but basically he argues, and I think that's what makes sense of this book, that this book is an example of early Hebrew, of a certain genre of early Hebrew, of early modern Hebrew literature, and that is polemical satire. That what Meir Yisrael Breslau was writing here, the method it's clearly polemical. I mean, he's trying to argue against the Hamburg Bezdin, but it's satire. And once you put it in that context, you can understand it. Without that, it was just so confusing. So keep that in mind, and we'll look at it. Once you understand that it's satire or it's polemical satire, it's masterful. Then it just makes sense. Or else you just think like, I got the wrong book. Okay, so he says, Tani, you have to shem lokecha. Now, this is kind of a preface. It's a Gemara in Yuma, and that he's quoting. You shall love the Lord your God, that the name of heaven should be loved through your hands. Because what does it mean to love the Lord your God? How can you love God? So the Gemara says that what you do, that how you act, people should look at you and they will come to love God because of how you act. How is that? I think we read this before, that if you're a Talmid Chacham, if you study Torah and you get along with human beings nicely, what do people say about, and you do business faithfully, what do human beings, honestly, what do human beings say about you? They say, happy is the one, happy is his father, happy is his teacher. But if you study Torah and you don't do business honestly, and you're seen as a boor, as somebody who has no manners, or, is backward, then it's a chilul Hashem, it's a desecration of God's name. Now that's a very appropriate thing to begin with. This is not satire, it's a quote from the Gemara. But what's he saying here? He's saying, my argument, against the Hamburg Beis Din, I'm not going to just reiterate all the tshuvas about whether you can play an organ on Shabbos by asking a non-Jew. He's looking at the big picture. He's saying we're at a position where we can either desecrate God's name or sanctify God's name. If you want to sanctify God's name, you have to have a Judaism that people look at and they say, that's good. That's good for the world. That's honest, wholesome, and not and it's not hypocrisy. So it's not surprising that he starts with that. And then he quotes Rabbi Meir Bar Turdas Alevi about sending letters. Why send your letters to other lands? Ligdor Pritzot, to shore up the breaks in the fence, and to give rebuke to others. Instead, you should rebuke yourself. Now, I think he's not talking about rebuking himself. He's talking about let the Hamburg Beis Din rebuke themselves. And then even, I pointed this out last time, even the phrase that he uses to indicate the date that this was written, V'yatza chinam ein kasef, is a quote from the Torah about a servant, a Jewish servant who has to be freed. He is freed without money. So he's talking about freedom here. Okay. And then he says, Zot ladat, right? This is a preface. Zot ladat ki hamichtav halaz nitfas l'chvar Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Rasa. So he prefaces what he's going to write with, I want you to know I'm writing this for the honor of God and God's Torah. And not, God forbid, lekanter, to go against or to undermine or to anger Jews. I'm doing it for the honor of our Kila, Beit Yaakov, L'havdil ben or ben achoshech, to make a distinction between light and darkness. Now, why does he throw that in? It's probably a reference to the first book that was written in this whole polemical back and forth, which was Or Noga, a shining light. So, right, he's saying I'm distinguishing between light and darkness. I assume that's an underhanded reference to, I'm distinguishing between the first book written from the Reform side of Or Noga, which has the word light in it, and the Hamburg Beis Din's response, which is a response to it. He says it's very few and wicked, those who make quarrel, and there's falsehood. The whole congregation is holy. Now that's a quote from Korach, which is a little bit dangerous. And it's very small. Those who really trip up are very small. Those who are led astray by this attempt to bring light it's a very small number. Samim or lachoshech v'hilayla, that they make night out of what could be enlightenment, what could be day. Both tirmos kochai seyar, and that's when the animals come out. This is a quote from Baruch Nafshi. V'yal pihem gam zarim be'er shchistu et nachlat Hashem. and I'm going to show them the light of the pathway, and from darkness and from night. Ene Ivrim Tarena. Ene Ivrim Tarena. The light of those who are blind will begin to see. Because he's playing with this whole notion of light, because that was the name of the first book. And of course, it's about enlightenment and tradition, but not tradition that he sees as positive, tradition that he sees as holding back enlightenment that could be mixed together with tradition. Tizrach Hashem Meshiach, and all of these are phrases from Tanakh that are in Tehillim that are about light. The sun will go out, and this is a quote from Baruch Nafshi from the Psalm with Ambush Kodesh. V'masat tzedakah shalom, the act of charity will be peace. V'avodas tzedakah hashket uvetach ad olam, and the work of justice will create peace and or silence and security forever. So, right, he first is really laying out what he's trying to do. He's grounding it in tradition. That's the quote from the Gemara before about about sanctifying God's name. And then he is in a very kind of polemical way, quoting a lot of verses, saying we have to bring light. And then he says, to the holy who are in the land. Now, this also is a quote from Tanakh. Everything here is a quote from Tanakh. Because of three, the land is angry. Who are the three? So the three are the rabbis of the Hamburg Bezdin. The three who have put their names Be'et Barzel on the iron pen. That's the press. Boferet Tachat Patshegan Haktav. And they've sent out a letter. And they say it is to stop people from sinning. And they've lifted up a voice in the camp. Eitzarahi Liakov. They've caused a time of difficulty. They've said it's a time of pain for Jacob, for the Jewish people. Motzei Diba. So what's Motzei Diba? Motzei means those who speak out. Diba. Now this is a quote from the Torah about the spies. The spies who go into the land and report back falsely and speak lashon hara, slander about the land, are called Motzei Diba. Diba it means like lashon hara, slander. They brought out slander. But if you look at the word diba, he puts a little 2 lines here. 2 lines means it's an acronym. What's it an acronym for? Eile divrei habrit. He doesn't have the word eile here, but divrei, right? Daled hey bet is an acronym for divrei habrit, the words of the covenant. So he's making a very interesting pun here, that the Eile Divrei Habrit, the book that the Hamburg Bezdin wrote against the reformers, these are the words of the covenant, is also the acronym, Divrei Habrit is also the acronym Diba, which means Lashon Hara, which means slander. So it's exactly it's the word the Torah uses for slander that the spies bring. So he's like, he's such a chacham, there's so much rabbinic and biblical literature that's mixed into every line of this, but it's extremely polemical, but it's also in a certain way very searing because of its and he's rooting it so deeply in rabbinic tradition, not only in using sources of rabbinic tradition, but a method that's extremely rabbinic. And when you read this, you're like, wow, this is like a Haredi, from the 19th century writing, that about those we're scared of who are creating, it feels like you're reading the opposite book than what it really is. But that's just how he writes, and it's so extreme again that it could certainly be seen as satire. All right, so we'll start from here next time. Okay. So we'll spend some time on this book. It's fascinating because it's really, even though it's going to feel like reading Responsa because it's so grounded in rabbinic language, but you'll see very quickly that it's just so, it becomes absurd because he's writing from a different he's writing from the liberalizing perspective, but he's writing it as if he's sort of the Chassam Sofer. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good day.
Thank
Thank you.